Hello, everyone. My name is Kazuto Suzuki. Welcome to the Geoeconomics Insight special edition. Today, we are going to talk about this is actually the Monday, October 28th, which is the day after the Japanese general election. And we are going to discuss about the very unusual and probably historic election result and what will be the implication for the Japanese politics and the US-Japan relationship and wider international affairs. So we do have a very interesting set of the the election result, but today we are going to discuss with our guest from Japan Society, the president of Japan Society, Dr. Joshua Walker. Japan Society is part of a coalition of the or strategic partner of the International House of Japan, where the Institute of Geoeconomics belong to. So we are actually working together as one team, and also we have our research director, Professor Yuichi Hosoya, another guest commentator on the Japanese, everything about the politics. So we are going to discuss about the election and the election result. So Hosoya-san, can you start explain and describe what happened?
Okay, thank you very much, Suzuki-san. As Suzuki-san mentioned, we have had just less than 10 hours since the whole result was revealed. So definitely we didn't have a sufficient time for the preparation. But as Suzuki-san already mentioned, we all understand that this is quite historic for a certain senses. Number one, because now I like to say that the age of political stability in Japan has ended. Now we are entering into the time of instability and unpredictability. Actually, even before that, every 1 year, before the second Abe's administration, we had seen that every year we saw a new prime minister. So before the second Abe's administration, we experienced quite unstable Japanese politics for many years. And since Socialist Party around the end of the Cold War actually gained huge numbers of seats in the upper house, for nearly 2 decades or 3 decades, it's always difficult for the LDP to gain majority in both upper house and the lower house. So now, after the end of temporal political stability, I would say, we are now once again entering into the time of instability in Japanese politics. And this is also the case for many liberal democratic countries. Like in the United States, maybe I think that Josh would afterwards talk about the bipolarity and the rise of populism in American politics, other countries as well. So in many countries, we have been discussing on the retreat of democracy. I don't think that we see it in Japanese politics, but at least the political stability which we have been enjoying for a decade or so actually now ends with the current election result. Number two, I also like to point out that the political gamble of Prime Minister Shigeo Ishiba failed miserably. He thought that, number one, by doing a snap election, just 8 days after the forming of his own government, he thought that he could escape to win. But at least he actually couldn't accomplish his mission. One of the reasons why Kishida resigned was, of course, because of his low supporting rate among the public opinion poll. And also he thought that the succeeding prime minister could perhaps win the upcoming election. But Ishiba couldn't do it. In this way, it is undoubtedly the case that perhaps Prime Minister Ishiba has lost strong support or strong political foundation within the LDP. I'm sure that many within the LDP would start to try to remove Prime Minister Ishiba from the Prime Minister's office by bringing some other to that post. But that internal struggle actually was one of the reasons why Japanese voters actually didn't vote for the LDP. So that domestic internal struggle within the LDP, alongside with the underestimation of the anger and the frustration of Japanese voter in the LDP politics, I think that was underestimated by many DAT members, particularly the current LDP executive members at the top. So in this way, maybe they really need to change their understanding about the mindset of the Japanese voters, because next year there will be a upper house election. So in this case, I think that LDP needs a radical reform, but I don't know whether LDP can do it under the Prime Minister Ishiba's leadership.
Right. How about you? What's your take on this election, and any response to what Hosoya-san said?
Yeah, first of all, it's great to be back with you guys. I've known you for a long time, even before I was president of Japan Society. I'm a recovering academic in many ways. I still teach
you are academic throughout.
Always.
Yeah, but I think what's great is to be back home in many ways. And I think I say that the last time I was in Japan was here at the International House of Japan to join the board. And also on the day of Ishiba's selection. I think that was a historic day also. Nobody knew what the outcome was going to be, and in fact it seemed that Ishiba's selection was maybe the best choice the LDP could have made given the circumstances, right? I think, as you already pointed out, this was a disaster, an unmitigated disaster, and I think no one saw it coming. I landed and I was watching the polls in the newspapers, but many people I was meeting with said, don't worry, Joshua. Japanese, at the end of the day, remember what happened last time, back in 2009, and then what happened in 2011 in particular, that the DPJ government is not sufficient. And therefore, they will always, when they get into the voting booth, will always select the LDP. I think in many ways, the voters proved them wrong. I think the voters spoke very loudly and very clearly last night. I think in many ways it was a fact that the CDP, in many ways, the main opposition party of Japan, was very clever in selecting Noda-san, the last prime minister of the DPJ government. Some of us in the U.S.-Japan world joke that if he had been the first president, first prime minister of DPJ, maybe they would have lasted longer. Yeah. And so I think that it was really, it was not as much a confidence vote in the CDP and Noda, but it was a real anger and frustration with the LDP. I think many people didn't see this coming, but I would say that unlike the U.S. election, I think that there will be kind of adults in the room. I think the bureaucrats have a big role here. The business community has a big role here. The stock market hasn't changed. I was really shocked. I thought the stock market would tank because of the political instability. I very much agree with Hosoya-san's idea that this is the end of stability. We have gotten kind of used to in international affairs the Abe-style approach. We had 12 years with the longest-serving Prime Minister Abe, a very orderly transition to Prime Minister Suga, and a very orderly transition to Kishida, and more or less an orderly transition from Kishida to Ishiba. But now what happens next is very different, because whatever the LDP does, if it is in the ruling coalition, it's going to have more enemies inside than outside. Right. And so if I'm Ishiba, I can't really govern from a foreign policy point of view because I'm always watching my back. That's not a good thing for the world. I think that these election results are very similar to what happened in Britain, actually, right? As you said, around the world, from Britain to France and even in the United States, populism is on the rise. But I have to tell you, I am very confident in Japanese democracy. Last night, as I watched the election results, I was really jealous. I wish that American coverage was like this, because the NHK broadcasters were so specific in showing every district of Japan and what this means, and watching the key districts. What was going to happen to Hagiuda and Seiko that were kicked out of the party, but are in some ways were able to win in different ways. In America, most of that journalism has become entertainment journalism. And in many ways, it's about the divisions in American politics. Now, I think that this shows there's a real division within the LDP. But I think it really shows that Japanese want some type of leadership. And I think the question is, how can we, as your friends from the outside, play a role? I'm not Japanese. I can't vote in the Japanese elections. I'm from Hokkaido, I'm a Dosanko, so I'm very proud of my governor. But when I looked at the map, Hokkaido has a different perspective than people in Tokyo and certainly in the south. So, I was very, I was encouraged by the coverage and the kind of the adult response from both parties. I listened to Shinjiro Koizumi take full responsibility for the election results. He also called for an earlier election. And I thought Ishiba's comments back made me think that he's going to do everything he can to find a responsible way of transitioning in some way. And we don't know how long he will last. Is this a matter of months or a matter of a year? At this point, it seems unlikely that he can survive. We all thought maybe until the upper house election, and if he had a good result, he would have a chance. Now, I guess the question to both of you is, what does this mean for Japan becoming no longer a global actor, because it now needs to focus on domestic politics? Because as we know in political science, all politics is local. So I'm curious what you think about this.
Well, I think it's well. First of all, it's very interesting. By the way, I just came this morning back from Sapporo, so I was. Yes, I was.
My hometown. I miss
it. It's my hometown.
Yes.
Too. I mean,
Our
was
hometown.
so we all have a Hokkaido experience, but and as we know that Hokkaido has been very strong. Hokkaido is a stronghold for the Socialist Party, DPJ, and then CDP. So it's not surprising that the CDP come back. But anyway, I think this leadership issue is quite concerning because Ishiba initially was the outsider from within the LDP.
Yes.
So he was, initially he was an enemy within, and he has to watch his back, even though he is leading. Well, if he wins the election, the idea of having this snap election was basically to give him more power. If he wins, then he would have more command in the party. But because of this result, his position in the LDP is going to be extremely weak, and he has to make a coalition not only with Komeito but some other parties because it's a minority government. So he has to deal with this within the party. He has to deal with the coalition partners, and then he has to deal with an opposition. So, of course, he's going to be a very domestic. But whether the Japanese, the last decade of Japan's rise in the geopolitical as a geopolitical power or geoeconomic power is because of this very strong leadership of the Abe and Kishida. But at the same time, it was a systematic concentration of the power to the Prime Minister's office, Kante, and to lead the policies through the NSS, the Kokuka Anzen Hoshokyoku, or the very strong leadership by some of the ministries like Ministry of Foreign Affairs or the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry for the industrial policy. So I think even Ishiba is not really this very strong leader. The last decade has set up these certain policy trajectories to increase the power or the presence of Japan in the international affairs. So probably that may be that may continue even in the weaker political leader. So probably this may be a interesting test for the Japanese political system as a whole, whether it can be resilient even in this sort of a very very weak leadership case.
Yes, I largely agree with what now Suzuki-san mentioned about, because institutions matter. In the last decade or two, Japanese politics has been transformed in many ways. Like we have now National Security Council with National Security Secretariat. Akiba-san as a National Security Advisor is really, really effective and quite influential at the top of the institution. And also we have security legislation. We have the Economic Security Promotion Act. So in the last 1 or 2 decades, Japanese politics has been evolved and can be adapted to the current quite turbulent international environment much more effectively. But at the same time, I think that Ishiba-san has not been quite good at governing the government at the top. He is good at criticizing government from outside as a quite notable outsider. But governing is really difficult job. So in the first administration, Abe's administration, the Shinzo Abe faced many difficulties in governing his own cabinet and the government. But in the second, his administration, he could do it brilliantly with much stronger political foundation. But he took a few years to create such a strong foundation of his own government in the second Abe's administration. But I think that maybe Prime Minister Ishiba or Mr. Shigeru Ishiba underestimated the difficulty of creating a strong political foundation. Without creating a strong political foundation, he couldn't do or he couldn't implement what he really wanted to do. But we do not know what he really wanted to do. He's a military otaku, geek. But we don't know what he is really going to do in his administration. In this way, I don't know whether he really can resist effectively to many criticisms, both from within, from outside, and together. So if he cannot survive, of course, we will see another new prime minister, but before that, he needs to form a coalition. It depends on how he can create a coalition. If he cannot create a coalition, or if he cannot find a partner to support his own politics, of course, he cannot survive. So he needs to rely on, say, like other members within the LDP to do this negotiation. So if he cannot do it, he will be alone, and LDP will be alone with Komeito, and they will lose the government.
Yes, I think this weak leadership is more seriously impacting on the relationship with the U.S.-Japan alliance. And of course, in November 5th, in less than 2 weeks' time, we are going to have an election, and we have, who has the voting rights in the United States to elect one of the leaders. So how do you see this election result in Japan will have an implication of the. Of course, it's not going to change the result of the U.S. election, but whoever wins, what will be its implication to the U.S.-Japan alliance? Especially Mr. Ishiba, well, he has this idea of being more equal, to be more autonomous from in the U.S.-Japan alliance, to be more, to have more equity with the U.S. and to reform the state of force agreement or the Asian NATO. There are some not traditional policy idea. Of course, because of his weakness, he cannot carry on this idea. But still, he has some sort of a tendency of not really being aligned with the traditional U.S.-Japan alliance management. So how do you see these effect of two elections?
I mean, look, the interaction of democracies, particularly in this day and age, where there's a clear narrative forming that democracies are incompetent. They cannot manage their affairs, and that authoritarian states can plan a 5-year plan and are more successful, is definitely a concern. I mean, yes, as you said, I can probably count on one hand the number of Americans who know as much about Japanese politics as certainly I do and you do. Most Americans are probably just watching in kind of amusement because just like what happened in Britain, there was a complete shift in government, but it didn't change the special relationship with the United States. America is too important as a military power, and certainly in a case like Japan, where our bases and the nuclear umbrella shapes the entire foreign policy arena. So I think that in many ways it is a bit of a lopsided relationship. And I thought what was interesting is because Ishiba comes from a deep defense security point of view, his comments were interesting. And I was asked by many Japanese media to criticize him because they wanted a comment on how ridiculous the NATO and Asia comment was, or the renegotiation of the status of force agreement. My perspective is it's different to be campaigning than to govern. I sincerely hope in America's own democracy, what my presidential candidates have been saying don't come to pass, because it will have a direct negative impact, not just on China, but on Japan as well, because the tariff, the trade regime, all the things that in a post-war environment have made Japan the miracle that it is, and has really led to the opportunity. But I would point out two things. Number one, Shinzo Abe went to the Congress and gave a speech on the Alliance of Hope, and Prime Minister Kishida just this year, only 6 months ago, we forget so quickly, gave a speech that really tried to explain to the American people how America's leadership was appreciated and that Japan was going to stand side to side. And it was only after that speech that our own Congress, which has a particularly challenging time, a bit like the Diet, was able to pass the Ukraine bill, right? And so I think that the problem is when you have a weak leader in Japan, it doesn't have a big impact on America's economy or on America's role internally. But the tendency that both candidates have to look inward during an election is only reinforced because we have no allies around the world that are capable of stepping up. Whereas, Kishida was able to increase the defense budget from 1% to 2%. Abe called for a strong and robust leadership. And even with Donald Trump the first time around, when there were North Korean missiles flying, Abe was able to clearly, articulately, and without making Donald Trump lose face, explain why this is a problem for the world. And I worry that I don't see that same characteristic in Ishiba. Number one, he doesn't have the international background. Of the 9 candidates who ran for LDP president, 7 had degrees from America, 5 from Harvard. Only the 2 candidates with no degree from America were the top 2 candidates, right? Mrs. Takaichi and Mr. Ishiba. And I respect Keio a lot because I'm sitting next to a Keio professor and of course Todai as well. But I do think that that's a concern for us. And I think that as Japan watches the US presidential election, in some ways I'm a little bit disturbed. Because it looks to me like the discussion about Moshi Tora that's now become Hobo Tora, right? Like maybe Trump and definitely Trump, that's entertainment journalism.
Right.
That's not getting to the core of the challenge. Because the truth is there's been no discussion about foreign policy in this election. This is, for you guys, 2-week election and it's over, right? We've been going through 2 years of an election. And now we're entering the home stretch of the last week and a half. And just last night we saw Donald Trump in my town now, New York, going to Madison Square Garden and making a speech. It's not going to change the electorate. My vote in New York is not going to change. It only matters in the 7 battleground states. And most people are feeling very insecure about the world and that America should not pay for anyone's security. Look at what's happening in the Middle East. America has the ability, because of our energy independence, to let Israel do what it wants in the Middle East. And even with the attack on Iran, which in years past would have been a game changer. It would have been the October surprise that happened to Carter and led to Reagan. This time there was no reaction. And of course, Bibi Netanyahu would like Trump to become president. And there are many people around the world who I think are looking for a strong man leader like Trump represents. But ultimately, I think Japan is in the best position in the world to manage whoever the president is. But I think it's because of the strong institutions. It's because of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Akiba-san and the National Security Council, because of METI that have those relations. If you have chaos in Naratacho and you have business leaders and others who begin to say, who are we following and what are we doing? I think that's a recipe for disaster, not in the short run, but in the long run. I sincerely hope that my friends in Japan, including you all that have great connections, can help whoever the next leader is understand that this is bigger than just you. It's bigger than Ishiba versus Takaichi. This is really about Japan's role in the world that you've invested so heavily in the last 12 years, and that if you squander it and give it up just because of internal politics, it's going to have a direct impact, especially on a trading state like Japan that is dependent on its international relations. You depend on oil in the Middle East. So I cannot do anything about that, but you're dependent on your relations there and also how things play out in Taiwan vis-a-vis China. If China sees weakness in Japan, that's not a good thing for the world.
Well, Jose-san, do you... It seems that it's quite an overstatement of Japan making all this, the leadership of the Japanese leadership would have such an impact on the international affairs. But yes, you're right that Japan has dependency on the oil and of course the relationship with Japan and China, of course, had a significant impact on the global stage. But at the same time, Japan as an ally of the United States, and and make sure that we are going to have the at least within the certain context. I mean, Japan alone cannot have any impact on the Middle East, and I think you're right that the speech in the Congress by Prime Minister Abe Prime Minister Kishida had made a certain impact on the the U.S. Congress decision on the support of Ukraine, and I think there are many ways that Japan can influence and as an actor to make decisions at the United States, but Japan alone cannot just simply do it to have a significant impact to change the situation.
Can I make one point on this?
Sure.
Because I think Japanese underestimate your own power. You may not be a military power. You may not be able to be number one in economic power. But when it comes to cultural influence right now, there is no country in the world, including the United States, that has more ability to bring people together. So while you may not have a direct impact on Israel's relations in the Middle East, when I think about the Saudi crown prince, do you know one of his favorite things? It's anime.
Anime, yeah.
Everybody knows that. And so there is something beyond. I think, in international relations theory, oftentimes we get stuck in these paradigms about power. And generally speaking, in the current world we live in, it's all about realism and how the power of a nation, right? But I think that there's a whole dimension that has been discussed by Joe Nye and others about hard and soft power. And I would simply say, at the same time we're sitting here talking about politics and which team is going to win, right? You guys are wearing blue ties, I'm wearing red ties. Is that a political statement? But I think the more important thing is there's also a big World Series going on here in baseball. Here's an American sport that is being dominated by Japan, and the Japanese national team is up 2-0 against my Yankees. I mean, the Dodgers. And I think looking at that, the great thing about sports is no matter who wins the World Series, we all win. But in politics, no matter what happens on November 5th, whoever wins, I think we all lose.
Yeah.
And I think that is a key point. And I think if you get too stuck in these paradigms about, the economic and security and other things, you miss Japan's ability. The fact that this International House of Japan brings people from around the world, Asians and Americans, to have conversations. It's much more comfortable for me to have that conversation here than even in New York during the UN General Assembly. Your Prime Minister came to New York. He didn't even go to the UN General Assembly.
Right.
It means that the international system, in many ways, that we have known since the end of World War II, is dramatically changing. And therefore, the levers of power are not what traditionally we have focused on, particularly in the Cold War. So I think that is an area that we all have to consider. And as we think about our next domestic leaders and what we want, maybe the leaders we're looking for are not just the president and the prime minister, but it actually is Shogun and Shohei Ohtani. That it may be Japan's greatest cultural asset besides whoever your prime minister is.
Right.
Well, thank you very much, Josh, for saying about that. And of course, I agree that we shouldn't underestimate the influence of Japan in many ways in the United States or in international society. But at the same time, I also like to say that here in Japan, shouldn't underestimate the power of American power of optimism.
Yes.
The United States has always brought something quite positive. And it's interesting to know that both candidates, both Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, they are saying that they like to make the United States or the world better. So they're trying to do that, whichever wins. So in this way, I think you also, Josh, you exemplified American way of optimism, trying to bring better things to the world, to the United States, to the US-Japan alliance. And I think this is important because now we are becoming much more inward-looking and nationalistic, and the populistic and also politics has become much more bipolarized in many ways in the world. So under the current situation, it's easy to see that bilateral relation will get worse with many, many problems. But you mentioned about the US-Japan alliance. If we compare to the US-Japan alliance of today with 2 decades ago, 3 decades ago, we can say that the situation has get much, much better. And not just the situation gets better, but at the same time, the US-Japan relation becomes much more relevant to the world. The US and Japan together, because 2-3 decades ago, Japan played much smaller role in international community. But the United States has been supporting Japan's increasing role in the world. And Japan is doing it. So with the U.S.-Japan alliance, Japan can be more influential in the world. And this is partly because of American power of optimism. Optimism in Japan, because after 1945, United States believe, the Americans believe in Japan, the future of Japan. That's why they help in many ways the Japanese reconstruction. So you are doing it. You are doing it also as the president of the Japan Society. And I'm glad to hear that from your words.
No, I appreciate that. And I would also just point out that if you think about the day after a war in the Middle East and a day after the war in Ukraine, I think there are more countries in those regions that would welcome Japanese investment and Japanese involvement than our own. Because I think America has become almost like the evil empire, where no matter what we do, we will be criticized for it. And also because there are double standards, right? Why is Iran an Islamic state and Saudi Arabia is not? They have elections in Iran. They don't have it in Saudi Arabia. But it's because Saudi Arabia is an ally and an important country. And so I think Japan doesn't have some of the same problems we have because we have an internal strong debate about where we should be allying our countries and others. Japan is the perfect example of being able to bring both. And actually, it's in America's own self-interest for Japan to play a leading role, even if Japan doesn't think that it should play a leading role. Because again, I think Japan has a lot, and I think my fear is that if you don't have that bold vision for the future, and you have simply managers of the alliance and not leaders, which I believe that Abe and others were, and we have another prime minister that just doesn't think it's their responsibility to do anything other than to try to win elections and try to put together a coalition, that's a dangerous thing. I think you have to start by having peace at home. That's great. You got to have stability.
Yep.
But now that the LDP has been really humbled, will they come out of this with the same resiliency that Prime Minister Abe did? You know, people forget he failed miserably the first time, and he came back, and that had never happened in Japanese politics. Let's see, right? Like, is Kishida coming back? Is that what we're heading towards? Because he was clever enough to understand what was happening. So I have great hope in Japan, and I look at the two of you as well. When we started our careers, you were always looking to America and American academics and think tanks to do this. Now you've created something here with the geoeconomics group that I think is valuable to the world. And so it's a two-way street. And I think as someone who grew up in Japan, I do speak too much, I guess, but I think I want to listen more, and I want to see Japan's presence in a way that is not preaching to the rest of the world, like sometimes Americans have a tendency to do.
Well, of course, you've been speaking a lot, but I think that's what all this is all about, and we are very happy to have you. And I think this very positive note is very well suited for the end of this very dooming feeling of the because of the result. And I think, yes, I think you're right that. I think Japan should be more confident about its own position, not to take a position of certain colors and taking standards like the United States, supporting certain countries in the conflict. But Japan is often try to make a balance and try to be more, stand on the neutral ground. Although it was a case of the Russian invasion in Ukraine that Japan immediately responded that this is a violation of international law, and therefore, we stand with Ukraine. And of course, Japan would have a lot of role to play after the end of this warfare. But also, Japan takes a very unique position in the Middle East, having a diplomatic relationship with Iran, and also having a balanced approach with Israel and Palestine. I don't know if this election result will change that Japanese posture in the international affairs, but I think that even so, the leadership is the key for the Japanese behavior in the international affairs. And I think this election result may not in the short term be helpful for Japan to boost its position, but I think this is the sort of one challenge that Japan needs to overcome to make sure that we'll be able to manage the international affairs during a difficult time internally. And also, I think there are certain hopes that Japan will learn the lessons from this experience of. I think since 2009, 2012, there were a certain confusion of the Japanese foreign policy, especially with regard to the U.S.-Japan alliance. But Japan has learned from it, and then that was the sort of necessary lessons that we need to learn in order to bring the more capabilities in the society and in the international society. And I think Abe administration could not exist without the 3 years of the DPJ government. So I think in that regard, this experience, I don't know what will happen after this election, who's going to take the leadership. Of course, there won't be a sort of a change of government, but at least the fracturation of the power is going to give more stronger challenges in the party. But still, if we are able to manage that, then we can learn a lesson from that, and then the next generation of leadership will have more stronger views in to play more vividly in international affairs. So the time has come, and we really appreciate Joshua to join with us, and probably we can do more of this. Since Japan Society and the International House of Japan has this strategic coalition, and this partnership will last longer than current government, for sure. So
that's a safe bet.
Yeah, it's for sure. So I think we will have another opportunity to discuss about elections or the politics, international affairs, and the geoeconomics interests. So I think we'll see. Probably the viewers see Joshua more in the future. But for a moment, thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And however, political instability following the election could temporarily slow down and will complicate these efforts. And if Ishiba remains in power and manage to secure stable coalition,